I fixed her broken heater on the coldest night of January, and she left a note under my door the next morning. And I want to be honest that I almost didn't read it. Not because I didn't notice it, a folded piece of paper on a hardwood floor is hard to miss on the way to the coffee maker, but because it was 6-40-7 in the morning, and I was operating on 4 hours of sleep after spending most of the previous night on my back, under a radiator that had developed opinions about whether the people in apartment 4B deserved warmth. And I had about the same cognitive bandwidth for unexpected correspondence as I did for running a marathon. I picked it up anyway because I am fundamentally unable to leave paper on the floor. And I unfolded it at the kitchen counter while waiting for the coffee. And it said, "The heat came on at 3 a.m. I cried a little. "Thank you, 4B. That was it. No name." I put it on the counter next to the coffee maker and went to work and thought about it 3 times before noon, which was 2 more times than the situation probably warranted, and which should have told me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. Let me go back to the night before, because the note doesn't mean anything without the context of how I ended up under a radiator in a stranger's apartment at 11 o'clock on a Thursday in January. My name is Declan. I'm 32. I've lived in apartment 4A of a 6-story pre-war building on the west side for 3 years. And I work as a mechanical engineer for a firm that does mostly commercial vac systems, which is a job that is about as unglamorous as it sounds, and which I find genuinely interesting in the way that people find things interesting when they've spent enough time with them to see the complexity underneath the surface. The building I live in is old in a way that means it has character and also means it has a radiator system that was installed sometime in the mid-20th century, and that requires, from time to time, what the building's super, a man named Pete, who has the specific energy of someone who became a superintendent by process of elimination, rather than ambition, describes as attention. Pete's relationship with the boiler in the basement is approximately the same as my relationship with the paperwork my firm requires, technically within my competence, managed with minimal enthusiasm, and sometimes neglected until something stops working. I should say something about the particular social architecture of the building I live in, because it matters for understanding how 2 people can share a floor for 18 months and never learn each other's names. The building is the kind of place where people move to be in a city without being of it, not antisocial, but private, operating with the specific urban compact of people who have agreed, tacitly, to coexist with minimal friction. People hold the elevator door and say good morning in the lobby, and that is approximately the full extent of neighborly contact, with exceptions that are rare enough to be remarkable when they occur. I had, in 3 years, learned the names of the couple on the 2nd floor, Tom and Maria, friendly. Had a dog named something I could never remember that looked like a small bear, and the older woman on the 6th floor, Mrs. Hawley, formidable, occasionally left baked things outside neighbors' doors at Christmas. Everyone else I could describe physically and by floor number, but not by name. This was not unusual for the building. This was the building's social contract, and I had adopted it without much examination. It stopped working on the night of January 9th, which was a Thursday, which was a day when the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees and the wind was doing something that the weather app described as advisory conditions, and which I would describe as a personal offense. I got home at 6:30. Noticed my apartment was colder than usual, checked the radiator, found it was not responding to the valve in any of the ways it was supposed to respond, and texted Pete, who replied 40 minutes later with "on it," which in Pete's vocabulary means "I have acknowledged this and will address it at a time of my choosing." I put on a heavier sweater and made dinner, and told myself it would be sorted by morning. At 9:15 there was a knock on my door, which was unusual because the building is not the knocking on doors type everyone does their living behind their own door, with the specific urban privacy of people who have chosen density as a lifestyle and have made peace with the trade-offs. I opened it, and there was my neighbor from 4B, who I had seen perhaps 6 times in the 3 years we'd shared this floor, always in passing, always briefly, and whose name I had never learned despite us being separated by approximately 12 feet of hallway. and a shared wall that was thin enough to occasionally transmit the sound of someone's television on a quiet night. She was wearing a heavy coat over what appeared to be pajamas, the specific layering of someone who had not planned to leave their apartment that evening, and she had the expression of someone who had weighed the social awkwardness of asking a near stranger for help against the temperature inside their apartment and found the temperature more compelling. "Hi," she said. "I'm really sorry to do this. My heat went out this morning and it's been 6 hours and Pete isn't answering and it's 48 degrees in my apartment and I noticed your lights were on." She paused. "I don't actually know what I'm asking for. I just needed to knock on something." I said, "Do you want me to look at it?" She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating what they'd expected from this interaction. "Can you do that?" I said, "I'm a mechanical engineer. I can probably figure it out." She said, "That seems unfairly convenient." And then, immediately, "I'm sorry. That came out wrong. Yes, please." I got my toolkit. I keep one because old buildings and professional training create a particular kind of preparedness. And I followed her across the hall into 4B. And I want to describe the apartment for a moment because the description matters. It was the same layout as mine, but organized entirely differently, with the specific geography of a person who had made deliberate choices about every surface and arrangement. There were plants on every windowsill, the specific winter plants that survive low light, and bookshelves that covered an entire wall with the specific density of someone who had been acquiring books for years and hadn't decided what to do with the accumulation. There were drawings on one wall, architectural drawings, the kind you do by hand rather than by software, framed and arranged with an eye for how they talk to each other. The apartment smelled like coffee and something warm I couldn't quite identify, wood smoke from a candle, I thought, or something baked recently. And it was, as she had said, extremely cold. She was not exaggerating about 48 degrees. I could see my breath. Her radiator was in the bedroom. Because the building had the specific logic of pre-war construction that had never entirely been rationalized into consistency. And we went to it, and I crouched on the floor next to it and started working. And she sat on the edge of the bed, still in the heavy coat, watching me in the specific silence of someone who doesn't know what to say and has decided not to fill the silence with something inadequate. I appreciated this more than I told her at the time. The problem was a stuck bleed valve and a secondary issue with the supply pipe that had partially seized from the cold, the kind of thing that requires patience and the right tools and the specific willingness to be uncomfortable, none of which Pete had reliably demonstrated. I worked through it methodically, the way I work through field problems, starting with what was observable, ruling things out, following the pressure back to its source. It was absorbing in the particular way that hands-on mechanical work is absorbing, where you stop thinking about everything else and attend only to what's in front of you. And I was aware, at the edges of this absorption, of the specific quality of the apartment around me, and of Vera sitting against the wall not far away, and of the particular quality of her silence, which was not uncomfortable but full. She brought me a cup of tea at some point without asking whether I wanted one, which I thought was exactly the right call. And she made one for herself and sat on the floor against the wall a few feet away, and we talked. The way people talk when one of them is doing something that requires occasional focused attention and otherwise allows for conversation, not continuously, but in the available gaps, the way a conversation finds its own rhythm around a task. I learned, in those 2 hours, that her name was Vera, that she was a structural engineer at a small firm that did mostly historic preservation work, which explained the hand-drawn architectural drawings on the wall, that she had lived in 4B for 18 months and had, like me, been navigating the particular social geography of a building, where proximity and privacy exist in a specific and delicate balance. I told her about the Vedic work, and she asked technical questions that told me she had actual engineering background. And we had a conversation about pressure differentials and old cast iron radiator systems. That was the most interesting conversation I'd had at 11 o'clock at night in some time, which is a sentence that says something about both of us. She had a way of asking follow-up questions that indicated genuine engagement rather than polite maintenance of a conversation. The way some people ask and then what happened, while clearly waiting for the answer to conclude rather than because they actually want to know what happened next. Vera wanted to know what happened next. I found this quality immediately and specifically attractive. Without putting that word on it at the time, at 11:40. The radiator clicked and then hummed and then produced the specific metallic, knocking sound of heat moving through a cold pipe, which is one of the better sounds I know professionally and which produced, in Vera, an expression of relief so genuine and unperformed that it caught me off guard. "Oh, thank God," she said, and put her face in her hands for a moment, and then looked up and laughed, the laugh of someone releasing something that had been held for a while. "I've been so cold," she said. "All day. I was wearing my winter coat in my own kitchen and making tea every hour just to hold something warm. I held my hand near the radiator and felt the heat beginning to move through it. There's a specific satisfaction in fixing something that has stopped working. A particular quality of completion that isn't available in most things you do with your time. And I felt it then more acutely than usual because the apartment was cold and the woman sitting on the floor near me had been cold in it all day. And fixing it felt less like a professional action and more like a personal one. Though I didn't let myself examine why the distinction seemed to matter. I said I was sorry it had taken that long. She said, "Are you kidding? It took you 2 hours to fix something that Pete has been on for 6 months. That was impressive." She paused. "Thank you. I mean it. I'm sorry I knocked on a stranger's door at 9:15. I said she was welcome and that it wasn't a strange thing to do given the circumstances. And I packed up my toolkit and went back to my apartment and got into bed and thought, before I fell asleep, that Vera from 4B was interesting in the specific and uncomplicated way of someone who asks real questions and holds actual knowledge and laughs the way she laughed, the relieved, unguarded kind, and that I would probably wave to her in the hallway now when I hadn't before, which was approximately as much as I was prepared to acknowledge about the previous 2 hours. Then the note. I read it at 6:47 in the morning, standing at the counter waiting for the coffee. It said, "The heat came on at 3 a.m. I cried a little. Thank you, 4B. That was it. No name." I put it on the counter next to the coffee maker and went to work and thought about it 3 times before noon, which was 2 more times than the situation probably warranted, and which should have told me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. The note was brief. It said the heat had come on and that she had cried a little, which was not something most people would include in a thank you note to a neighbor they barely knew. And the inclusion of it produced in me the specific quality of attention that comes when someone says something more honest than the situation strictly required. "I cried a little" is not a line you put in a note to manage an impression. It's a line you put in a note because it's true and because the person reading it will understand why. And neither of those reasons require editing. Then, the following morning, another note, "The heat is still on. I made extra coffee and left it outside your door in the thermos I don't use. Please don't be weird about it." There was a thermos outside my door. I was a little weird about it internally, but I drank the coffee, which was good, and I left the thermos outside her door with a note of my own that said, "Good coffee. Not weird. 4A. This became, I understand now, a correspondence. Not immediately. There were several days between the thermos and the next note, and several more between that and the one after, and at no point did either of us frame it as a thing we were doing intentionally. The notes were small. They were about specific things, a reference to something one of us had mentioned during the 2 hours in her bedroom. A question about the architectural drawings I had asked, she had answered. She had followed up with a question about something I'd mentioned about the building's original mechanical system. A single line about the specific sound the radiator made on cold nights that we could both hear through the wall. They were not love letters. They were the correspondence of 2 people who had discovered, accidentally, that they found each other interesting, and who had landed on this particular format for the specific reason that neither of us had made the more direct move of simply knocking on the door again. I thought about knocking on the door approximately 4 times during those weeks, and I did not knock on the door because the notes had a quality to them that felt fragile in the specific way of things that work exactly as they are and might not survive being changed into something else. Vera's notes were the way she talked. Direct, specific, slightly dry, occasionally funnier than you expected from the setup. One of them said in its entirety, "Pete fixed the boiler today." He was very proud of himself. I thanked him warmly and did not mention that you had actually fixed it 6 weeks ago. Another said, "I was in the building that became the mechanical drawings on my wall today." It looked exactly like the drawings, which is either comforting or unsettling, and I haven't decided which. A third, which arrived on a Tuesday in February for no reason I could identify. Saw the radiator made a new sound last night. Not alarming. Just new. I thought you'd want to know. I had not, before that note, understood that someone telling me a radiator had made a new sound would be the thing that made me sit at my kitchen table for 10 minutes not doing the thing I'd been about to do. I was starting to have opinions about her opinions, which is a specific kind of interest that does not resolve itself easily. I left notes in return. Mine were less naturally dry, I was working on it, but they were genuine, and she responded to them in ways that told me she read them carefully, which I found every time specifically pleasing. The notes stopped in March, not because anything had happened, but because I had started a project that required me to travel to another city for 2 weeks. And I'd left without thinking to say anything. And when I came back, there was no note under my door, which I interpreted initially as simply the natural pause of a correspondence, and interpreted initially as simply the natural pause of a correspondence, simply the natural pause of a correspondence, and then, as days passed without resumption, as something more ambiguous that I was not sure how to address. I slid one under her door, my first initiative in the correspondence, the previous exchange having been loosely alternating, that said, "Back from Chicago." The boiler held up while I was gone. That seems like a good sign. She did not respond for 4 days, which was longer than usual. And the 4 days produced in me the specific, anxious awareness that I had let something lapse through inattention that I should not have let lapse. I want to describe what those 4 days felt like, because I think they matter. I had not, before the Chicago trip, fully understood how much I had come to depend on the notes as a specific and reliable pleasure in my week. Not urgent, not dramatic, but present in the background of things in the way that good things tend to be present, not demanding attention, but noticeable in their absence. I came home each evening during those 4 days and checked the floor below the door in the specific, reflexive way I developed without noticing I'd developed it. And the floor was empty, and I was more aware of the emptiness than I knew how to account for. I also thought, during those 4 days, with a clarity I had been avoiding, about what the notes actually meant. Not in the abstract, I knew what they meant in the abstract. I had known since probably the February note about the radiator making a new sound, but in the practical sense of what I was going to do about it. I was 32. I had been in relationships before. I understood what the thing developing across 12 feet of hallway was, and I had been, for several months, allowing it to be contained in the format of folded paper, because the format was safer than the alternative, which was knocking on a door in real time with no particular pretext and saying the thing directly, which was the kind of exposure I had been declining without quite acknowledging I was declining it. For approximately the entire length of the correspondence. On the 4th day, there was a note under my door that said, "I wasn't sure if you'd left because the correspondence had run its natural course or just because of work. There's a difference, and I couldn't figure out how to ask. I think I was waiting for you to establish which." 4b. I stood in my kitchen holding this note for some time. I thought about the answer to the question it was asking, which was less a question about the Chicago trip and more a question about whether I wanted the notes to continue and what exactly I thought they were. I had a clear answer to this question. The answer was that I wanted them to continue, and that what they were was the most consistent and interesting form of communication I'd maintained with anyone in the past 2 years. And that the person I was maintaining it with was someone I found specifically interesting. And that I had been behaving for 3 months. Like someone who was satisfied with a proximity to a thing without being willing to close the distance. On the 4th day, there was a note under my door that said, "I wasn't sure if you'd left because the correspondence had run its natural course or just because of work. There's a difference, and I couldn't figure out how to ask. I think I was waiting for you to establish which." 4b. I stood in my kitchen holding this note for some time. I thought about the answer to the question it was asking, which was less a question about the Chicago trip and more a question about whether I wanted the notes to continue and what exactly I thought they were. I had a clear answer to this question. The answer was that I wanted them to continue, and that what they were was the most consistent and interesting form of communication I'd maintained with anyone in the past 2 years, and that the person I was maintaining it with was someone I found specifically interesting, in the way of a thing that stays in your mind because it's actually worth staying there, not because you're filling a gap, but because the thing itself has content and that I had been behaving for 3 months, like someone who was satisfied with a proximity to a thing without being willing to close the distance. I had been managing this proximity with considerable skill in retrospect. I had also been doing something inefficient with my time. I slid a note back, work, not the end. But I think we might be running out of room in this format. That was all I wrote. I went to bed. At 7 the next morning there was no note under my door, but at 7:15 there was a knock. And I opened it and there was Vera from 4B, in her regular clothes rather than the coat over pajamas configuration of the first time. And she had 2 coffees from the place on the corner, not the thermos this time. Actual cafe cups, which meant she had gone out for them. Which meant she had planned this. And she said, I thought we could try talking in real time and see what happens. And I said that sounded like the right next step. And she handed me the coffee and we stood in my doorway for a moment with the morning light doing what morning light does amiss. Building in March. And then I stepped back and she came in. We talked for 3 hours that morning. The way we talked during the 2 hours with the radiator, except without the radiator as an organizing task. Just the conversation finding its own structure the way it had found its own structure then, not continuous. But complete. Covering the things you cover when 2 people have decided to actually know each other. She told me about the historic preservation work in detail. About a building she was currently trying to save that had been slated for demolition, a 6-story industrial building from the 1880s in a neighborhood that was being redeveloped. The specific kind of structure that had no legal protection and whose architectural value was real but not the kind that produced institutional support, and about the particular feeling of working to preserve a structure that other people had decided was finished. She described it with a precision and a feeling that told me this was not just professional investment but something more personal, the way certain work becomes personal when you've spent enough time inside it. And I listened with the full attention that she had earned over 3 months of notes. From me. I told her about the half project in Chicago and about the specific satisfactions of mechanical engineering that were hard to explain to people who weren't mechanical engineers, and she understood them immediately and added dimensions I hadn't articulated. We talked about the building, about Pete, about the radiator, about the specific social contract of apartment buildings, and how you could live 12 feet from someone for years without ever finding out who they were, and how the heater breaking in January had been the first time either of us had broken the contract. At some point, she got up to use my kitchen to refill the coffee and move through the space with the specific, unconscious ease of someone who has decided they belong in a place, which I found striking and did not comment on at the time. I thought about knocking on your door a lot, she said at some point, and I always talked myself out of it. How? I asked. She thought about it. I told myself the notes were a complete thing on their own. That requiring more from them would be greedy. I said, that's almost exactly what I told myself. She looked at me with the specific expression she'd had at the beginning. When I'd said I could fix the radiator, the recalibration, the surprise at the convenient convergence. That's a lot of parallel self-deception for 12 feet of hallway, she said. I said it probably was. She looked at me for a long moment, the coffee in her hands, the morning light doing something specific to the apartment, and then she said, without the careful hedging that most confessions of this kind acquire in the saying, I think I've been interested in you since the night with the radiator. Not in a slow-building way, just immediately and then consistently since then. She said it the way her notes read, direct, specific, not ornamented. I found this so characteristic and so entirely her that the thing I felt in the moment was not the usual surprise of someone hearing what they'd hoped to hear, but the specific recognition of something that was simply true and had been true for a while and was now being said out loud where both of us could look at it. I said, I think I knew that on the morning of the first note. I just didn't know what to do about it yet. What did you figure out? She said, I said that I wanted to be someone who knocked on the door instead of just thinking about it. She smiled. The same relieved, unguarded smile she'd had when the radiator finally came on. The one that I had found back in January. Unexpectedly and entirely arresting. We finished the coffees. We talked about her preservation project, specifically about the building she was trying to save. And she mentioned that the structural assessment she'd been working on had been submitted the previous week, which meant the next few months would be the waiting period between argument and decision. The specific anxiety of having done everything you could and now needing the world to agree. I told her the waiting period was the hardest engineering period too. The gap between submitting calculations and receiving approval, when you've done the work correctly and have to trust the process to recognize it. She said that was exactly how it felt. I said, I hope they save it. She said, I think they will. The bones are good. And then she looked at me in the morning light and said, I'm glad I knocked on your door in January. Even though I almost didn't. I said I was glad too, which was the most obvious thing I had ever said and also entirely the most accurate. She has a key to my apartment. I have a key to hers, though I use it primarily to water the plants she hasn't yet moved to my windowsills. We have dinner most evenings and she tells me about buildings and I tell her about systems and we disagree about things with the specific comfort of two people who are confident enough in the other person's good faith to actually disagree, rather than performing agreement. The radiator on my side of the wall has not broken again, which I take as either good luck or the building recognizing it has already done its part. I still have the first note. I still have all of them, if I'm honest, in a small stack in a kitchen drawer where I keep things I haven't decided what to do with yet. Batteries, takeout menus, a spare key whose lock I can no longer identify, and 14 months of folded paper from 4B Vera knows I kept them. She has never asked to read them, which I think is because she already knows what they say. She wrote them. I fixed her radiator again in November, because Pete remains Pete. And she handed me a cup of tea while I was on the floor with my toolkit and she sat against the wall the same way she had the first time. Same wall. Same posture, same tea. Though we were now people who knew each other's names and had keys to each other's apartments and had been spending most evenings together since March, and at some point she said, I still think about that first night sometimes. How close I came to just putting another blanket on and not knocking. I said, I thought about it too. She said, what would you have done? I said, eventually knocked on your door for some other reason. The building would have provided an opportunity eventually. She said, that's very optimistic. I said, or just true. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I have come to understand as her specific version of being moved, the one she uses when something matters enough to hold, rather than release. The one that doesn't announce itself, and then she handed me the tea. We were quiet for a while, the radiator knocking as the heat came through, and I thought about notes slid under doors in parallel. Self-deception in 12 feet of hallway and the specific. Luck of a boiler breaking on the coldest night of the year in a building with the right neighbor on the other side of the wall. I thought about the first note with its 6 words and its small, honest detail about crying. I thought about the thermos. I thought about the February note about the sound. I thought about a woman who had knocked on a stranger's door at 9:15 on a January night because she needed to knock on something, which is the most honest description of why any of us reach toward anyone, and which I think about every time the radiator makes a sound, new or familiar, and am grateful that she chose my door. The drawings from her wall are in my hallway now. 3 of them. She hung them one afternoon while I was at work and mentioned it that evening in passing. The way you mentioned something that was never really in question. The plants continue their migration. The thermos she left outside my door that first morning lives on my kitchen counter now, used every day. Its original purpose of the thermos I don't use having been resolved some time ago, into its current purpose of the one I use most. She thinks this is funny. So it is one of several things that started as small and turned out to be large, which is, I think, the correct direction for things to move. There is a note on my refrigerator, held there by a magnet she brought from somewhere, that says, the radiator made a new sound last night. Not alarming. Just new. I thought you'd want to know. I kept it because it arrived at the moment I understood, for the first time clearly, that someone was paying the specific quality of attention to the world that makes you want to be inside it with them. Not to me specifically, to everything. To the sound of a radiator on a cold night. To the look of a building that solved a problem 100 years ago. To the specific satisfaction of a thermos of coffee on the right morning. I wanted to be inside that attention. I wanted to be someone it was directed at. She knows the note is there. She has never mentioned it, which is either because she's forgotten writing it or because she knows exactly what it means that I kept it and has made the particular choice to leave it where it is. I choose to believe it's the second, because I have learned. Over 14 months of notes and mornings and a radiator that keeps having opinions about the people in apartment 4A. That Vera is the kind of person who notices everything and chooses carefully what to mention. She also knows that I kept all the others. There are 43 notes in total, in a kitchen drawer where I keep things whose significance I haven't entirely resolved. Batteries, takeout menus, a spare key whose lock I've forgotten, and 5 months of folded paper from 4B that somehow turned into the beginning of a life. She found them once when she was looking for a takeout menu, and she looked at them for a moment and looked at me and said simply, "All of them?" I said yes. She said nothing else, which is the specific way Vera says the things that matter most. Not with words, but with the particular quality of a silence that does not require them. Then she found the menu and ordered dinner, and we ate at my kitchen table the same way we ate most evenings, and the drawer sat closed behind us. And neither of us mentioned it again, and I understood, from the way she'd looked at the notes, that she was not surprised I'd kept them, and that she had probably kept mine too. In whatever drawer she keeps the things whose significance she hasn't entirely resolved.